David Hall. You are visiting professor at Greenwich University's Public Services International Research Unit, known to insiders as CSIRO, which was set up at the turn of the millennium to specifically study the impacts of privatisation on public services, including water. Your research has given you a perspective of water privatisation right across the world, far beyond what most of us are aware of here in Britain. May I ask you to start us off by painting a word picture of how Britain's water privatisation fitted into what really was a privatisation whirlwind that swept the world?
Yeah, whirlwind's a very good term for it, and also for the generality of it. Stepping back, it's no coincidence that we describe this as whirlwind of privatisation, because there were things there to be privatised. These were the public service networks that had been set up in the 19th and 20th century through public investment, public action, and public political commitment to universal systems. Water and energy are the two sort of classic examples of that. They needed to be universal for some very simple reasons. In the case of water and sewage, for example, some places tried experimenting with leaving it to households to decide if they wanted to be connected to sewage, the consumer autonomy. But then people realised that actually if I decide to connect to the sewer, but my two neighbours decide no, they're going to carry on chucking it in the garden, the healthiness of my environment hasn't been improved much. And so it became compulsory around the world. This is not a consumer thing, this is a public health thing. And then, of course, there were the economic arguments about networks like sewage, water and energy, which is that once somebody's built one network like that, it's never going to be worthwhile for a competitor to spring up and build another one. And that's what's meant by the term natural monopoly. So you have all these powerful reasons for the development of, and this is what happened in the 19th and 20th century, the development of water and energy networks. Not only did they bring terrific health benefits, they also brought terrific economic benefits, because it enabled, along with transport networks as well, the development of economic activity around. So that's what was there, established worldwide across the global north, and much of the global south even, by the 1980s. So what happens in the 1980s? Why do people suddenly decide that these public networks should be privatised? And there's really quite a simple answer. It's a combination of a political drive, the politics of neoliberalism, the politics that say that the economies should be restructured around the private sector activity, doing things for profit, and that's the most efficient way to do anything and everything. And especially after the colonies had been lost, as it were, through independence, leaving these big areas of the economy, public services, being run by the public sector without taking any profit out, without accumulating anything, was seen by investors, if you like, capital, business, however you want to put it, as a wasted opportunity, that they wanted a slice of the action there. And so that was why I think it really has to be called a sort of political economy set of reasons for doing it. There were both the politics coming up, but also being driven absolutely by investors saying, we want a slice of that action and can hang on to that slice. So it happened in the UK. Water was just one of the areas that was being privatised in the UK and elsewhere. It happened in the UK, in England and Wales to be precise, in 1989. There were one or two countries in the world that had some degree of privatisation already and who increased it at the same time, notably France. But then it was taken up by the World Bank as part of the privatisation crusade, and the World Bank was basically saying to countries throughout the global south, we can give you millions, in some cases tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in very favourable loans for developing your systems, on just one condition, that you privatise the water systems. And so city after city in the global south was faced with the choice of Do they want a £200 million World Bank loan to develop a water system and just privatise the whole system? Or do they say, no, we want to run it publicly, it's our system, this is a democratic country, it's a better way to run things publicly, and struggle on to do it without a $200 million loan? So that was the companies wanting a slice of the action, and the World Bank multiplying it around the world by these conditionalities was what created that whirlwind as you described it.
And what were those companies offering in return for this?
Well, yeah, the companies were offering in return, well, everybody knew that firstly they were much more efficient than public sector companies. That was a well-known fact, or rather the most original bit of fake news ever. And it's shocking how many people still believe that. But they were offering greater efficiency, private sector efficiency. They were offering greater investment. They said, we have shed loads of money, which is true. We have billions. So we can invest in what you need. And the third thing was, because we're so efficient and good at investment, we'll get everybody connected, everybody paying their bills, and so prices will come down. So efficiency, investment, and prices coming down were what the big promises.
And looking back with the benefit of hindsight, to what degree did those promises of greater investment in water infrastructure, improvement of water supplies, better wastewater management, to what degree did that become reality?
Almost none at all. England and Wales have kept firmly in step with that result as well. There are two bits of research we did at CSIRO, which on the question of how much was actually invested by these private investors. The first one was research we did nearly 20 years ago now, and it was commissioned by one of the development NGOs who said that all these water companies saying, you privatise, we will invest. Can you do research and tell us how much they've invested? And so we did what now sounds ridiculously ambitious, and it was hard work, and it did take some time. We looked all around the world, across the global south, where the private water companies had gone. We've been tracking them, so we knew where they'd gone. We knew the various projects, and we could look at place after place after place. And what we found in place after place after place was that they'd promised investment, but apart from the World Bank investment, the World Bank loans, the companies themselves weren't investing anything. There was one wonderful article about after the privatisation of water in Buenos Aires by the biggest water company, Suez, who were nudged and reminded that they promised investment of about $100 million, or possibly even $1 billion. Anyway, let's say $100 million. And they said, oh yeah, we've forgotten that. And they ran around and said, well, we've got this World Bank loan, of course, of 40 million. Then we got some loans from there, and then we got some loans from there, and then we're going to increase prices and get more revenue in, and there you are, 100 million. And one or two people said, hang on, we didn't notice you actually investing any of your money. To which we said, no, it's a good result, isn't it? We don't have to invest any money, but we get to own the business and to take out of it as much as we want in via dividends. So that was really quite a surprising result then, looking across the global south. No, the promised investment didn't materialise. We did a much simpler bit of research 6 months ago on England and Wales, because people kept saying, but how much? Surely the shareholders have been investing something. They're not just taking out dividends. They must be investing their own money. And after a bit, we realised that actually there was a fairly simple methodology for assessing how much they put in. I look at how much they paid for the shares in the first place, which are on the books of the company, and then how much money is on the books of the company today. And what we found was that when updating the value of everything to current prices, the net investment by the English water companies over 36 years since privatisation is minus 9 billion. In other words, not only they haven't just invested nothing, they've invested less than nothing. They have taken out 9 billion that was in there right at the beginning, which included some of the surplus of the old public companies that they'd taken over. So categorically, the companies don't deliver investment. On efficiency, loads of comparative studies were done by people mostly expecting to show how dramatically efficient they were. And there were some academics honest enough to publish the results saying this isn't what we expected or wanted, or indeed what we still believe. But having looked at the comparative efficiency of public and private operators, even across Africa, for example, all the way across Africa, we found that there's no significant difference. Okay, so there's no extra efficiency you get from private sector. What about prices? Well, actually, no, they don't go down, they go up. Recent study from the USA itself compared public and private water operators in the USA, and what they found was that private prices are different from prices in publicly run services by a factor of 59%. They are 59% higher, other things being equal after adjusting to than public prices. Shockingly high. There were less shocking result from a similar comprehensive study in France, 16% higher, systematically really higher.
So, cities and countries that have seen that their citizens are, should we say, not being well served by this privatisation process, what action have they taken to try to redress the situation? Are there countries which are ahead of us in Britain in this regard in fighting the battle to get a better deal for their citizens?
Yeah. And it's one of the few things that can be said in the, well, firstly, say, almost everywhere from the 1980s onwards, there was massive public resistance to water privatisation in particular, but also other privatisations. That resistance, incidentally, included Britain. In the mid-1980s, there was, when Thatcher first announced the plan to privatise water, a big campaign sprung up, which included everybody. It included the unions, it included environmentalists, it included the National Society for Protection of Birds, it included the National Farmers Union even. No, we didn't want it. Thatcher dropped the proposals when she saw how strong the privatisation was because there was an election, the opposition was because there was an election coming up. Once she won the election, she relaunched the proposal and went ahead anyway. But it was never supported here. And that was true all around the world. So there were big campaigns, frequent battles, some amazing campaigning going on. I mean, in Montreal in Canada, there was, French-speaking Canada, the campaign set up a special theatre group to tour the hinterland of Montreal, doing plays in every suburb, every village, about what a disastrous idea it was. Fantastic sets of responses. And in country after country, privatisation was either prevented or, after a shorter or medium term of years, reversed. And so I genuinely think that it's one of the very few areas where we can say overall, globally, in the neoliberal area, we've actually won battles in resisting. Broadly speaking, who's won the battle over privatising water or not? The answer is we have, except for some pockets where it lingers on, which England and Wales, regrettably, is one big pocket.
So Paris would be a city example. We are sitting here in London, which has taken back into municipal ownership in that case, it's water.
Yeah.
And how is Paris looking at the moment, if you're a water consumer or a citizen of Paris?
Paris is looking pretty well and wonderful at the moment. When Paris remunicipalised its water 15 years ago, the price of water immediately came down by 8% at least. Paris developed far more openness, public services like water fountains, indeed water fountains with that were you could press a button for carbonated water if you prefer that. And indeed, Paris also launched, in the wake of remunicipalising the water service, it also launched a campaign to advise Parisians there was no point wasting their money at all on private water, bottles of private water like Perrier and Evian, because the water from the taps was far higher standard of purity and it cost about 1/100th of the price per litre. So they really developed it. And most recently, it's been a very interesting contrast between Paris and London. In the last 10 years, London's been building the super sewer, as it's known, to supposedly deal with the sewage problems, while Paris spent those 10 years treating the water of the Seine to a sufficient standard for Olympic swimming competitions to be held in it, which was an unthinkably high objective for London or any other city. And at the end of that 10 years, Paris and the upstream authorities and the government had spent 1.5 billion euros, and they delivered just enough. They had very bad luck with the weather, but they delivered just enough to have Olympic swimming in the Seine in the heart of Paris on time. Over the same period, London got a super sewer being constructed that many people think was unnecessary in the first place, that hasn't actually yet been completed to full standard to be handed over, which we will be paying for the next 40 years, and which cost £5 billion. So it's an illustration of the differences, that both in terms of sort of cost and ambition, public ambition, and so on, that can be achieved.
So if we wanted to follow the example of Paris or other countries that have said we're going to take our water back, have we strapped ourselves into a system where it's legally impregnable and where it would cost us the earth to compensate shareholders and this kind of thing? Or is there a way through that would be legally and financially plausible?
Yeah. We've strapped ourselves into a form of privatisation that is much more difficult to undo than the normal form. The normal form of privatisation around the world has been at, as you rightly say, water almost everywhere is run by municipalities, local governments, regional governments, and if and when it's privatised on concession contracts. They're quite long usually, the concession contracts, 20, 30 years quite often, but they do have an end. They come to an end. And so when Paris remunicipalised its water, it was when the contract had come to an end. They didn't have to terminate it, they didn't have to pay anybody any compensation. And that was true for most places. Not all places. In other places, Berlin for example, they just terminated contracts and said we are taking it back in-house. And then they did pay compensation. Sorry, under the English and Welsh system of privatisation, we sold the entire systems to the companies, and they're given indefinite licenses to operate. And they had a clause in their licenses that says this license can only be terminated by the government giving companies 25 years notice. 25 years notice. Huh? No one is entitled to 25 years notice. Imagine having an employment contract where your employer has to give you 25 years notice. So this is all sort of strongly tied up, and the investors put forward the line that it'll be impossibly expensive in terms of compensation that you'll have to pay, and they commissioned a report 5 years ago which said, well, we think the investment will be, well, the compensation will be, well, 90 billion, and they did it by just adding sums of money together that shouldn't have been added together, and then saying, well, we're adding another 33% on top of that as well. This work was described as economically illiterate by Professor Dieter Helm, despite the fact that Dieter Helm himself is being a supporter of privatisation. He could not bring himself to support such a work. The Institute of Fiscal Studies, not the most radical institution in the country, also described it as producing some ludicrous results, like implying that the companies on the stock exchange would be entitled to 2.5 times as much as the total value of their shares on the stock exchange. So this is a ludicrous bit of work. However, by some strange mechanism, under the Starmer government, the Department of Environment, DEFRA, has accepted this line, hook, line and sinker, and so says it will be impossibly expensive. It's not true. Firstly, for a very simple reason, that British law has a very, very fundamental principle about compensation and expropriation, and that is Parliament has full powers to expropriate in the public interest anything it thinks necessary, and that was obviously used widespread in wartime, for example. Secondly, there is no automatic entitlement to compensation at all. Every bit of expropriation has to have specific compensation rights attached to it. Otherwise, they're not entitled to anything. And so even the international ratings agencies like Moody's agree that in estimating compensation due, government could and should take account of things like the hopeless underperformance of the companies, the amount they've already taken out, etc., etc. If all those factors were taken into account, the compensation due would get pretty close to zero. The other thing is that the way to, almost certainly the best way to bring companies back into public ownership is through a process called special administration. That is a process that is intended to protect public services, or protect important services even, to put the interests of consumers and the public above the interests of creditors and shareholders. And so it would be possible, for example, to take Thames Water into public ownership under special administration to keep the service going, to protect the service. And we have a leaked estimate from the Treasury that if that were to happen, the Treasury believes that the shareholders would be entitled to zero compensation, and even the people who lent Thames money to the tune of 19 billion debt so far would take a significant haircut of 40–50%. So, so no, it's not prohibitive. It just takes some political will.
And that last mention of Thames Water is because, like a number of water companies, they've given themselves an enormous amount of debt, which it turns out they can't actually pay. So is that part of that equation that the administration would play into?
Absolutely, it's part of that equation. And it's also worth noting that other analysis that's been done of debt and dividends over the years is that they haven't borrowed and used that debt to invest, to finance investment. They've borrowed, all of it has been borrowed in order to pay themselves bigger dividends. And so it just goes up and up and up. So.
Which other people are out there raising their voices, I believe. Do you want to mention some of those and the work that they're doing by way of finishing us off and pointing us in the direction of those that are trying to get our water back?
There's now been the increasingly strong campaigns developing, partly and in terms of publicity mainly, because of the campaigns by surfers and river users against the pollution of the rivers and sea. Because obviously, if that's how you want to spend your spare time, you do not want to find lumps of human sewage floating around. And so those campaigns have become increasingly vociferous and increasingly are beginning to sort of coalesce and talk to each other and realise, and certainly they've been driving much of the publicity. There's also other bodies. There's most prominently and centrally, if you like, the campaign We Own It campaign, which we've both been associated with, but it consistently focuses on public services and the problems of privatisation, how to get out of them. And so We Own It We Own It, for example, is currently doing a major exercise to demonstrate that public ownership is massively worthwhile as a better way of financing investment than the private sector, almost regardless of the amount of compensation. And then there's the unions, which are now coming, after many years of been quite silent on the issue, are now coming out saying enough is enough. And it's quite powerful, the unions saying this, because it's their members that are running the systems, and they know and can see what's going wrong. And they feel it should stop. So there's a big sort of weight of opinion building up. And just last month, for example, I attended 3 separate meetings, independently organised in Parliament, for MPs who are increasingly concerned about what's happening and about the inadequacy of what the government are proposing, because Starmer, apart from anything else, has actually tries to rule out taking water back into public ownership. But there are a number of MPs from many parties. There's a lot of Lib Dems, there's a number of Labour MPs, most obviously. At these meetings there were also 1 or 2 Conservative MPs, and there were also 1 or 2 Reform MPs. The reason being that Reform is beginning to see that if they stand up and say they think water should be in public hands. That might enable them to steal a few more votes from Labour come the next election.
And that is because in opinion polls, in opinion polls, it looks like a very popular policy.
Yeah.
You don't like their water being private hand, is that right?
Yeah, it's a massively popular policy. I still find it hard to believe how popular it is. The latest poll says that 82% of people think water should be in public ownership. Now that's astonishing, but opinion polls don't produce that sort of result on political issues normally. But in this case, it's energy and other services are not far behind. But 82% of people think it should be in public ownership. And this, of course, reflects the worldwide position. Because if we look beyond these countries and say, well, how do other people do it? We find the answer is, and this was another bit of research we did 20 years ago that is still true today, and only more so, we found that 95% of the world's water supply is run in public hands, is run by the public sector, including in the USA. And so we think there must be a reason for this. And the trends in the last 20 years have been away from privatisation. In France, for example, half of the cities that privatised their water in the 1980s have now remunicipalised it. Well, that's very strongly suggestive. And of course, we don't have to go far from home to do that. If you just go up to the border with Scotland, you'll find a country operating public water. It's in public hands, Scottish Water. It's 100% owned by the Scottish Government. There's a Scottish Environment Agency. There's a Scottish Water Regulator on the economic affairs. They all work together publicly. They have a much simpler and more progressive way of paying for water, that it's still charged for as part of the local council tax. The investment per head by Scottish Water has been running about 34% higher than in England and Wales. So you get actually higher investment. Prices, on the other hand, have not gone up to anything like the same extent, so you get lower prices. So we just raise our eyes across the border. Scotland's like that because they ran a very powerful campaign in the 1980s and 90s saying, you do what you like south of the border, but we don't want it here.
And a very heartfelt story to finish us with. And David Hall, thank you very much for giving us a wonderfully long-sighted and clear-sighted view of the murky waters of privatisation of water. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.